The overseer's arrival was marked not by ceremony, but by the slow, deliberate clatter of hooves, striking the dry earth, a sound swallowed quickly by the thick heat that hung over the plantation like a suffocating shroud. His horse's hooves struck a rhythm that seemed to beat an unnatural cadence against the cracked wooden porches and weathered dirt paths. No grand welcome awaited him, only the wary eyes of those who understood the weight of his presence before the man himself even set foot from the saddle. Who was this blue-eyed stranger, his gaze cutting sharper than the midday sun, and why did the very air seem to tense with the promise of cruelty? The questions flickered in the collective hush, though answers remained carefully locked behind the iron bars of silence. He wore a coat heavy with dust and sweat, the oily sheen of his patent leather boots dull under the relentless sun. The plantation, sprawling across the low, rolling hills near the river bend, had seen overseers come and go, men who carried both fear and authority like a second skin. But none had the icy stare that seemed to pierce shadows rather than light, revealing not just the cracked timber and dry tobacco leaves, but the secret, suppressed dread nesting in the quarters. His hands, calloused yet precise, rested briefly on the reins, fingers tightening as if squeezing control from the air. This was no mere arrival. It was a prelude drenched in something deeper, colder. What had brought this man into the heart of such rot and ruin? The ledger leaves gaps here, and rumors fill the spaces with whispers heavier than the summer heat. As he dismounted, the rough canvas of his trousers scraped against splintered wood and ragged fabric hanging from half-shattered windows. The slaves who moved among the smoke-tinged kitchens and hutches glanced up with furtive glances, heads lowering at once, half respect, half dread. Their hands, roughened by toil, paused in mid-labor, the scent of cornbread mingling with wood smoke thick in the humid air. The sound of fabric dragging across cracked floorboards echoed quietly in the cramped quarters, a ghostly rhythm followed by a tense silence as the overseer's gaze found each worn face, blue eyes that did not blink, did not soften. Was it the coldness in those eyes or the sharpness of his jaw that summoned fear? The answer hung like iron chains in the air, unspoken but felt in the quickening of breath and tightening of fists. From the main house to the edges of the slave quarters, whispers began to stir like a gathering storm. The mistress of the house, a woman cloaked in heavy silks and strained smiles, noted the rigid set of his shoulders and the brief, uncompromising nod he gave her. Even the plantation masters, accustomed to wielding control like a blunt instrument, felt the unsettling chill he carried. His reputation, more ghost than man, preceded him, stitched together from the fragmented reports of stolen hope and cracked spirits long silenced. Accounts suggest that overseers such as this man were skilled not only in coercion, but in weaving fear like a web, delicate yet unbreakable. What secrets did the blue eyes hide behind that stoic mask, and what fate awaited those caught beneath their gaze? In the quarters, the oppressive weight of his arrival settled like a thick fog, suffocating the faintest spark of hope. Children ceased their play, women stilling the hum of their songs, and even the older men, whose years had worn away many fears, shifted uneasily, sensing a darkness that had little to do with the physical or visible. The straw mats bore witness to silent prayers and clenched teeth, while the faint droning of cicadas outside seemed to be swallowed whole by something heavier. His shadow cast long across these raw lives, a symbol crafted of menace and power, yet beneath the surface, like tinder waiting for a spark, lay restless currents of resistance and fear tangled together, ready to ignite or suffocate. Would the overseer break the fragile equilibrium or become swallowed by it? Only time would unravel that thread. And so, the overseer's hat, a hat of coarse felt, edged with the faintest traces of threadbare gold, rested forgotten on a battered porch rail, a silent herald of what was to come. It was a stark emblem, distanced from the man's form yet charged with his unseen will, impossible to ignore and heavier than any object on that scorched earth. The hat, like the overseer himself, hung poised on the edge of absence, as if daring the shadows to swallow more than just a man. What weight bore this simple artifact? left where all might see, but none might touch. The tale of the blue-eyed overseer had begun, not with a scream or a strike, but with a lingering, oppressive silence that spoke louder than any command. Whispers gathered like restless shadows in the tight spaces between the wooden walls of the slave quarters, voices barely more than a breath against the thick heat that rolled over the plantation lands. Within these cramped, springy floorboards and mud-walled huts, the blue-eyed overseer had become a subject of hushed speculation even before his arrival. Those who lived within the rough timber cabins spoke quietly of him, not out loud, for fear might summon punishment like a swift lash, but in the flicker of eye contact, the trembling of hands, and the sharp intake of breath when his name crept into the conversation. Who was he really? Was he different from the overseers who had come before, or merely another cruel shadow cast over their fragile lives? The overseer was a figure both present and absent, his dominion marked not only by his watchful, merciless eyes, but also by routine and ritual. Accounts suggest he arrived with a ledger, keys, and an unyielding sense of control, holding the plantation's rhythms in his grasp. He patrolled the edges of the fields with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who knew every crack in the earth and every silence between voices. His job was twofold: to ensure the crops were tended with relentless efficiency and to suppress any hint of rebellion with a silent, oppressive hand. The law of the land bound him and the enslaved workers alike, the slave codes harsh and unforgiving, prescribing punishments that ranged from whippings to imprisonment. Yet, it was the overseer's gaze, cold and unblinking, that maintained the invisible shackles heavier than iron. Within the quarters, life bent beneath this pressure, with every measured breath. The scent of scorched pine from the cook fires, tangled with the sweat of endless labor, mingling in the sticky air that clung like a veil. Hands stained with dirt and calluses paused uncertainly at the sound of approaching boots. The overseer demanded more than work. He demanded unquestioning obedience, monitoring not only labor but the simplest acts, where eyes wandered, whose whispers carried what lies were hidden beneath bowed heads. Rations were doled with meticulous care, as if cruelly weighing the value of each life against the yield of cotton and tobacco. Clothing, coarse and rough, protected little from the merciless sun, while tools, hoes, scythes, and shackles stood as grim tokens of endless toil and unspoken threat. Suspicion and rumor festered as tightly as the mosquitoes across stagnant water pools hugging the fields. Stories passed from lips to reluctant ears, a stolen piece of corn here, a broken tool there, small acts of defiance whispered as fragile hopes or desperate gambits. Some claimed to have glimpsed secret meetings beneath the gnarled branches of oaks at dusk. Others told of messages tucked in hollow trunks, passed from hand to hand in the quiet hours before dawn. These tales were rarely spoken above a murmur, for punishment was swift and rigor cold as the overseer's stare. Yet the seeds of rebellion, however small, however dangerous, were planted in this fertile ground of fear and endurance. What peril lay in these whispered schemes? What price would be paid if the fragile balance snapped like dry timber? And then there was the peculiar weight of silence, thick, heavy, and unyielding, as the overseer strode back through the quarters, blue eyes sweeping the faces that dared not meet them. The slaves moved like shadows, bewitched by the knowledge that beneath the surface of their concubinage with survival lay an ever-looming question: would his rule be absolute, or might the whispered defiance ripple into a storm? The unseen gathered tension was palpable, a taut wire bristling to break, a breath held too long in the lingering heat. The overseer bore the weight not just of law or punishment, but of a terror more profound, the terror of loss, the loss of control, of dominance, perhaps even of the very self he sought to impose on others. Would you dare to imagine the divide in those eyes, the blue clarity of dominance masking a hollow, calculating depth? What secrets nested within the sharp glint as he watched the faint stirrings of rebellion form like wind in dry leaves? Within these mundane yet charged moments, the plantation breathed and waited. The overseer ruled by sight and fear, but beneath that brittle reign, something nameless stoked the embers of unrest. The quarters held their breath. the ledger grew heavy, and the smoke of simmering defiance curled silently toward the sky. The overseer's role was a merciless balance of brutal command and precarious management, a heavy burden that stretched beyond mere supervision of labor. On this sprawling cotton plantation, he was the linchpin between the planters' distant demands and the enslaved workers bending beneath relentless toil. His mission was clear: to squeeze every ounce of profit from the soil and flesh entrusted to his care. Yet beneath the surface of whips cracked and orders barked lay a complex dance of control and calculation, where cruelty and cunning were wielded with equal precision. He kept meticulous records, ledgers of labor, accounts of rations, inventories of tools and crops, his fingers tracing the inked lines as if to affirm not only ownership, but the fragile order he maintained. The overseer held the plantation's keys, both literal and figurative, locking away supplies, storing weapons of punishment, and controlling the very movement of the enslaved. His house, modest yet strategically placed, lingered near the slave village, not close enough to breach the master's sanctity, yet always looming like a shadow of authority, a constant reminder of the gaze that never faltered. The law of the land demanded his presence, sanctioned his punishments, and underscored every act with the threat of enforced obedience. He was tasked not merely with overseeing work, but with enforcing discipline, swift, often merciless, whippings administered for the slightest infractions, the wielding of rope, the occasional confinement in stocks, all instruments finely tuned to break spirits and curtail dissidents. Yet total domination was never guaranteed. The overseer had to calibrate his cruelty, measuring how far to push without provoking outright revolt or losing the very labor he demanded. In this, he was no tyrant unmoored, but a wary manager walking the razor's edge between fear and productivity. Would the lash secure obedience or seed a revolt? Such calculations shadowed every decision. More than enforcer, the overseer was an arbiter of survival. He controlled food rations, the thin gruel and cornmeal handed out with the delicacy of a miser counting coins. Clothing, often coarse and threadbare, was dispensed under his watchful eye, a physical mark of control stitched tightly into the fabric of dependency. Even minor medical care fell under his domain, tending wounds, feigning concern, or more often, ignoring sickness until the body and soul bent to irreparable breaking. His presence infused daily survival with tension. Nourishment came wrapped in chains, relief shadowed by vigilance. And yet, beneath his harsh exterior, the overseer's authority was fragile, built on precarious social status and constant oversight from absentee masters. He was a man stuck between worlds, not quite accepted by the planter elite, often mistrusted by the enslaved, his power a facade sustained by law and fear. Some sought to climb the social ladder through this role, dreaming of someday owning land and slaves themselves. But the position was rife with danger, dismissed for either cruelty deemed excessive or leniency thought weakness. The overseer's world was one of uneasy alliances and daily silent battles. Amid the cracking whip and rustling fields, small acts of defiance flickered like sparks in a dark room. The overseer watched, always calculating, always wary. Could he suppress the growing unrest, or was the very system he upheld destined to unravel? His role was a grim inevitability, shackling the plantation's fate to his command, yet haunted by the faintest, persistent pulse of rebellion waiting to break free. What weight did this power truly carry, beyond fields and shackles, and what shadows lurked in the spaces between order and chaos? Small acts of resistance germinated like seeds beneath the overseer's relentless watch, subtle rebellions that whispered defiance in the spaces between labor and survival. The slaves learned to wield invisibility as a weapon, feigning illness with practiced breaths shallow and measured, dragging tools with languid strokes, or deliberately misplacing items essential to the plantation's lifeblood. These passive resistances were acts of shadows, difficult to detect or prove, yet they gnawed at the overseer's authority. Would the brittle walls of control hold against such quiet sabotage, or were they already cracked beneath the pressure of unseen defiance? But resistance was not always silence. Some dared bolder acts, theft of tools, foodstuffs, or fabrics, furtive plunders that sustained life but threatened the plantation's fragile economy. Others sabotaged the fields, wrecking crops or dulling the edge of blades, each gesture a flicker of rebellion against imposed submission. These actions carried fierce risks. Whippings, brutal lashings, or cruel punishments were swift and designed to terrorize as much as to discipline. Yet, even the overseer's iron grip hesitated before the resolve simmering beneath. How long could such simmering unrest be contained before it spilled over into flames? Rumors swirled of secret meetings under oak canopies and messages exchanged in the dark, binding the enslaved together in shared defiance. Some stories spoke of escape attempts, dangerous gambits, seeking freedom beyond the shadowed edge of the plantation's borders. The overseer's pursuers, armed with dogs and rifles, hunted these fugitives with a merciless hunger, but not all escapes were visible. Some fled in spirit through music, prayer, and the preservation of African names and customs. These cultural acts were themselves forms of resistance, acts of identity refusing erasure. Could the overseer's eyes truly penetrate the depths where such rebellion took root? Many women, burdened with a cruel inheritance, resisted in the most personal and tragic ways, terminating pregnancies or denying the plantation owners future increases in their enslaved workforce. Botanical knowledge passed through generations provided both relief and threat. A whispered fear among the masters was that the enslaved women might poison the overseer's table. The overseer was a man both feared and resented, but also watched closely by slave owners and masters. His reputation balanced on a knife edge between brutality necessary for control and the risk of inciting revolt that could destroy his fragile authority. Would these muted fires of resistance burst into open rebellion? Every stolen seed, every feigned cough, every whispered prayer was more than survival. It was a challenge laid bare beneath the hot sun. Yet the overseer, with his relentless gaze and whip, held the plantation's heartbeat tight, demanding labor and loyalty with the certainty of a tyrant, but the paranoia of a man whose power might flicker away like a dying ember. The slow, simmering tension between oppression and rebellion framed every moment and breath on this land, a silent contest fought in shadows and silence, waiting for fate's cruel tipping point. The midnight air carried a clammy stillness, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional drip of water seeping through gaps in the timber walls. That night, the overseer stepped into the slave quarters, an intrusion as unnatural as a wolf crossing into a garden, and then quite suddenly, he vanished. The news spread in muffled whispers and restless glances. The man with the piercing blue eyes, the one who ruled with a whip and a ledger, had disappeared without a trace. All that remained was the solitary emblem of his authority, his hat resting abandoned on the cracked porch rail. Darker now with dew, a silent marker of vanished dominion. How could a figure so imposing dissolve into nothingness beneath the nose of the plantation's watchful eyes? This disappearance shattered the fragile order sown through months of hard labor and anxious submission. Accounts suggest the overseer's nightly entry was met with a tension deep and tangible, a breath held long enough to drown the spirits of even the oldest slaves who had weathered decades of suffering. There are fractured stories. Some claim he was pulled into the shadows by unseen hands. Others whisper that the very earth conspired to swallow him whole. Yet the ledger offers no explanation. The pages turn blank where a man once held dominion. In the flicker of dawn's first light, the hat lay as the sole testament to a presence abruptly erased, its worn brim curling like a dark secret, refusing to be forgotten. Within the quarters, the atmosphere shifted like weather before a storm. Anxiety premiered alongside a cautious hope. Survival instincts clashed with impulses tethered to revenge and fear. Every wooden plank creaked underfoot like a whispered warning. Every sudden gust of wind stirred more than dust in the shadows. Eyes darted toward the empty spaces, once charged with his gaze, hands instinctively brushing away beads of sweat gathering at tense temples. Could this absence speak of liberation, or simply a deeper, more harrowing peril? The indelible marks of violence hung palpably within the silence, a reminder that control here was never absolute, only respected until something or someone dared defy it. Beyond the quarters, Murmurs reached the master's house, sharpened by suspicion and dread. The plantation's power structure, once dominated without question by the overseer, now trembled. The masters feared the ruptures beneath their feet, knowing well the costs of unrest. Laws brutally tipped against the enslaved, yet did little to stitch back order when the hand enforcing them disappeared. Soldiers and trackers fanned out, lanterns piercing the growing darkness, but the only quarry found was a disturbance in the air, a silence louder than any scream. The mysterious vanishing cleaved the plantation life in two, with oppressed and oppressor alike, questioning what control meant when the enforcer was gone. What became of a man whose very authority was symbolized by a hat left behind? Was he taken by vengeance, consumed by the shadows he once wielded? The hat, heavy with the sweat and dust of endless command, became a haunting relic, perched on that rail as if waiting for its master's return. Or was it a silent monument to justice, an anonymous reclaiming of power long denied? The story unfolded in the whispers and the stillness, the absence speaking louder than presence ever could, leaving everyone asking whether this was the beginning of freedom or simply a darker kind of reckoning. The overseer's sudden disappearance set in motion a fragile upheaval beneath the oppressive canopy of the plantation's endless fields. It was as though an unseen hand had loosened the tightly wound coil of fear, binding the enslaved, letting small, tremulous currents of hope surge forward. Rumors of rebellion, long simmering in silence, found fresh breath in the absence of the overseer's cold, unyielding gaze. Yet this was no grand uprising, no sweeping march against masters, but a delicate, dangerous dance of defiance and survival in a world measured by brutal balance. Secret gatherings flickered beneath the heavy oaks, where words once too risky to speak slipped like shadows between worn lips. Plans formed in whispered moments, hands connected not only in labor, but in silent kinship. The enslaved shared stolen knowledge of hidden paths, old stories of flight and resistance, and mapped paths beyond the plantation boundaries. Yet fear clung as tightly as chains, the knowledge that discovery meant whipping posts, shackles, and lives lost. These moments of rebellion were small and careful, not yet thunderous revolt, but a tidal shift in atmosphere, a reclaiming of wills long bent toward submission. Across the plantation, masters and overseers scrambled to reassert order. The power vacuum stretched uneasily, sowing suspicion not only among the enslaved, but between those who once wielded unchecked control. The overseer's successor arrived quickly, walking a thin wire between enforcing discipline and staving off outright mutiny. Records imply that in such moments, violence increased sharply, the lash cracked louder, punishments grew harsher, and scrutiny intensified like a pressure tightening the skin. Every move by the slaves was watched with suspicion. Every silence became a potential plot. How much longer could such a brittle system hold before the faint embers of rebellion burst into flames? Some slaves dared desperate bids for freedom, slipping quietly through the woods at dusk, crossing swollen rivers with borrowed strength, and vanishing into distant swamps. Stories passed in fragments spoke of those who escaped into the darkness, carrying with them the desperate hope of a life not dictated by whip or wage. Others, more subtly, engaged in acts of resistance rooted deeply in culture, singing forbidden songs, preserving traditions outlawed by law, and clinging to the intangible threads of identity that could not be commodified or broken. These acts, though quiet, were a profound reclaiming of self in a world designed to erase it. Would the overseer's disappearance mark a turning point? A spark that ignited a widespread revolt? Or was it a brief crack in a towering edifice that would soon be sealed with brutality? History reveals that such fissures often bred both hope and despair, courage and crushing defeat. Still, in that uncertain moment, the plantation held its breath, caught in the suspense between quiet defiance and the looming possibility of an eruption that could shake the very earth beneath chains and soil alike. The hat left behind remained, a silent witness to the subtle war waged not with muskets and gunpowder, but with resilience, courage, and whispered dreams of freedom. The aftermath of the overseer's disappearance and the subtle tide of unrest it unleashed rippled far beyond whispers and stolen moments. Plantation life, already forged under the iron fist of control and fear, shifted sharply as brutal reprisals carved deep scars into the fabric of survival. Records imply that such events bred harsh consequences for the enslaved, an expanse of tightened chains wrapped not just in iron, but in laws darker than any night sky. The fragile ecosystem of labor and repression tilted violently toward punishments meant to extinguish even the faintest ember of resistance. Violence surged in waves, but often indiscriminately. Those suspected of involvement, close neighbors, friends, relatives, were seized, lashed, imprisoned, or worse, sometimes with no proof beyond hearsay and fear. The overseer's successors wielded vengeance with swift cruelty. Whippings became routine, confinements grew longer, and instruments of torture manifested shapes, both physical and psychological. The terror was designed not only to punish, but to warn, turning the quarters into places haunted by shadows heavier than mere absence. What price did the community pay when justice blurred into blind fury, and punishment sought not only perpetrators, but entire families? Legislative responses across plantations and states hardened. The fear that such a disappearance might inspire broader insurrection led to laws stripping enslaved people of even the smallest freedoms. Restrictions on gatherings became strict prohibitions. Teaching to read or write was criminalized. Ordinances tightened, forbidding the carrying of money, the ownership of tools for independent farming, even the expression of faith without a white overseer's watchful presence. The overseer's vanished reign gave way to an age of surveillance, where every breath was measured and every movement logged. The law, once a body of ambiguous rules, became an iron cage tightening relentlessly. Yet, even amid these shadowed reprisals and harsher regimes, resilience endured. The community wrestled with fear and survival, crafting fragile networks of support beneath the suffocating weight of repression. Oral histories whisper of courage, quiet acts of preservation, coded prayers, secret songs, and stories passed from mother to child like precious treasure. The overseer's hat, long abandoned and worn, became a grim reminder of lost dominance, but also a symbol of the price paid for defiance. Was this legacy a caution or a call to unyielding spirit? The plantation's aftershocks were a crucible, forging both despair and determination. Lives shattered in fury's wake, but the will to endure, sometimes fiercely, sometimes quietly, spanned the broken paths of history. In the spaces between lash and ledger, hope simmered beneath the ash, awaiting its reckoning. The story of the blue-eyed overseer, who disappeared after entering the slave quarters, is no mere fabrication, but echoes a real historical pattern fraught with brutality, suspicion, and the uneasy tension that permeated plantation life. Overseers, often white men appointed to bridge the distance between absentee plantation owners and enslaved laborers, embodied the ruthless machinery of control. Their presence was marked by implacable authority, but their roles were precarious, caught between enforcing merciless discipline and navigating the volatile realities of rebellion and resistance. One haunting historical case that shadows this narrative is the 1857 death of Duncan Skinner, an overseer on a Mississippi plantation, found dead under suspicious circumstances. Skinner's end was first deemed a tragic accident. Later evidence and testimonies revealed the possibility of murder involving enslaved individuals resisting his cruel oversight. This event set off a chain of investigations and harsh reprisals, culminating in a swift, grim trial that led to public executions intended to quash fear and restore order. It reveals how overseers, though agents of oppression, were themselves vulnerable to violent upheavals born of the system they enforced. Records from 18th and 19th century plantations underscore the overseer's centrality to maintaining order and production. These men wielded power over every detail, from rationing food and distributing clothing to meting out punishment and controlling movement. Yet their authority was always shadowed by the threat of rebellion, the lingering fear that their life could be claimed by those they attempted to subjugate. The overseer's role might be understood as a figure trapped wielding cruelty to safeguard a fragile plantation hierarchy, yet constantly at risk from both the enslaved and the planter elite. This tension imbued overseers with a complicated legacy as symbols of harsh control and instruments of resistance's inevitable challenge. The vanished overseer and his hat, a silent but potent symbol, capture this paradox, the transient dominance of terror against the enduring, often unseen will to resist and survive. The delicate balance between command and chaos, obedience and revolt, shaped every shadow, every whispered story, and every heartbeat beneath the plantation's oppressive sun. In the long shadow of the overseer's disappearance, the plantation bore witness to fractured loyalties and mounting unease. Those who wielded power sought to fill the void left by the vanished man quickly, dispatching new overseers with steely gazes and a sharpened whip. Yet the void lingered, a haunting absence that warped the rhythms of daily toil and the fragile order enforced by fear. Historical accounts of overseers reveal a complex mosaic of control, ambition, and vulnerability, each man tasked with commanding a fractured world balanced on the edge of violence and submission. One such figure, Thomas Thistlewood, infamous for his ruthless oversight in 18th century Jamaica, left behind diaries that painfully document the cruelty inflicted upon enslaved people. Yet even amid his cruelty, his vulnerabilities surfaced, ranging from complex social ties with other whites, tensions within the plantation hierarchy, to the constant threat of resistance by those he sought to dominate. Thistlewood's writings underscored that overseers, while brutal, lived entrapped lives, echoes of fear and ambition intertwined beneath their iron control. Would the overseer's disappearance on the plantation echo such fractured legacies of power and peril? The historical case of Duncan Skinner, a mid-19th century overseer in Mississippi, offers a deeply human and troubling parallel. His sudden death, initially dismissed as accidental but later hypothesized as murder, triggered a swift and brutal response. Investigation revealed involvement by enslaved men, leading to rapid trials and executions intended not only to punish but to cement fear. Such acts underlined the tenuous nature of overseer authority, exposed to violent rupture beneath the surface of plantation order. The overseer's vanished hat became a symbol not just of lost control, but of the ever-present specter of revolt waiting beneath the fields. Records imply that overseers operated in a world where control was both currency and curse, constantly shadowed by the threat of rebellion and the realities of their own precarious status. Plantation owners demanded results, but feared the volatility their enforcers might unleash or fall victim to. The overseer's role occupied an ambiguous space, agent of a harsh system, enforcer of cruelty, and yet vulnerable to the very resistance they tried to suppress. His disappearance was not only a physical absence, but a rupture in the plantation's power web, a rift that exposed the fragility underpinning what seemed an unforgiving hierarchy. The blue-eyed overseer's fate, shrouded in mystery, resonates as a chilling reminder that the assertion of power in this brutal system was ultimately unstable. The story of vanished dominion, captured in the lonely presence of a hat left behind, speaks to the shadow play between cruelty and resistance, between the iron will of the overseer and the resilience of those he sought to break. In this tension, the plantation's true story breathes, a narrative not simply of oppression, but of fragile authority, always at risk of unraveling beneath the weight of history's relentless forces. The overseer's arrival on the plantation was never merely an event, it was a seismic shift in the lives tethered to the land, a shift carved in quiet dread and fractured hope. Men like the blue-eyed overseer were more than supervisors. They were the iron fist cloaked in the veneer of order. Their authority was officially mandated, a necessary extension of the planter's will, but it was vulnerable, fragile beneath the weight of resistance it sought to suppress. The arrival was greeted by the slaves not with curiosity, but with a tremor of fear, an instinct honed by years of brutal encounters and shattered spirits. Overseers occupied a precarious position, commanders tasked with enforcing unyielding discipline, records suggest, yet themselves ensnared in a system that demanded control through violence, fear, and relentless surveillance. The blue eyes that seemed to pierce shadows carried the calculated coldness of a man who understood his power was both a weapon and a shield against disorder. Yet these men were often riddled with ambition and conflict, Some sought autonomy and status beyond their transient titles, engaging in acts that blurred the lines between enforcer and exploiter. They were men walking a razor's edge, their lives as fraught with tension as those they sought to dominate. Historical records, like those recounting the violent career of Thomas Thistlewood in Jamaica, reveal overseers as figures emblematic of cruelty and contradictory humanity. Thistlewood's decades as an overseer and then plantation owner were marked by unrelenting brutality, but also by moments revealing the overseer's insecurities, fraught social relationships, and the omnipresent fear of rebellion. His diaries stand as grim testimonies to a regime built on terror and the tenuousness of authority, chained to acts of violence. The overseer's rule was never unchallenged. It existed in constant tension with the living, breathing resistance that threaded through the quarters. The fate of Duncan Skinner, a Mississippi overseer found dead under suspicious circumstances in 1857, echoes that tension with haunting clarity. His death was initially ruled accidental, but further investigation revealed signs of violent struggle and the likely complicity of enslaved men seeking to upend his reign. The rapid and brutal reprisals that followed, trials carried out with terrifying speed and executions designed as public warnings, underscore the precariousness of overseer authority and the desperate lengths to which the plantation hierarchy would go to maintain order. Skinner's demise is not an isolated incident, but a fragment of a larger narrative of contested power, resistance, and the fragile veneer of control. This complex interplay of domination and defiance, authority and vulnerability, finds haunting symbolism in the story of the blue-eyed overseer and his abandoned hat. The hat, left as a silent witness to vanished dominion, encapsulates the paradox of overseer power, imposing yet unstable, fearsome yet mortal. The plantation was a stage where the overseer's rule played out, a fragile act performed beneath the constant gaze of those bound to endure or resist. His disappearance disrupts the script, exposing fault lines in a system sustained by fear, violence, and an unyielding struggle for survival and autonomy beneath the oppressive sun. Thomas Thistlewood's diaries stand as some of the most chilling and comprehensive records of an overseer's life and brutality in the 18th century Caribbean. Arriving in Jamaica in 1750, Thistlewood quickly entrenched himself as a figure of ruthless control. His detailed journals, spanning over 14,000 pages, reveal the horrors inflicted upon enslaved people under his command and ownership. His writings blend meticulous observations of plantation operations with cold, often grisly notes on physical punishment, labor allocation, and the health of the enslaved. The tang of crushed leaves and the sting of salt rubbed into wounds are felt vividly through his accounts. More disturbing still are Thistlewood's records of sexual violence, where he candidly recounts thousands of assaults on enslaved women, sometimes with punitive repercussions for resistance. His diaries describe torture methods, including a horrific concoction known as Derby's dose, where flogged wounds were rubbed with lime juice, salt, and pepper before forcing a fellow slave to defecate into the victim's mouth, an act striking both for its cruelty and its symbolic degradation. Thistlewood's cold, calculated cruelty was documented alongside moments revealing his own insecurities and complex social ties, offering a window into the contradictory psyche of overseers who were both oppressors and trapped figures within the brutal system. Despite the cruelty, Thistlewood's diaries also reveal the persistent resistance of the enslaved. He described his frustration and fear at insolent and runaway slaves, as well as constant rumors of uprisings and broader insurrections. His interactions with the Jamaican Maroons, escaped slaves who lived free in the island's mountains, highlight an ongoing contest not just of physical control, but cultural survival. The lingering scent of smoke from maroon fires and the soft rustle of hidden paths embodied the ever-present, simmering defiance that no overseer, no matter how brutal, could fully extinguish. Thistlewood's writings are a grim testament to the violence and control that defined plantation life, but also serve as a document of endurance. Through these pages, the reader confronts the palpable tension between domination and resistance, the overseer's attempts to enforce order across a fractured and volatile human landscape, and the unyielding spirit that pushed back. His diaries embody the brutal reality and psychological complexity of overseer rule, a dark mirror to the vanished blue-eyed overseer, whose fate remains whispered within the slave quarters. Thomas Thistlewood's diaries are an extraordinary and harrowing window into 18th-century plantation life in Jamaica. These meticulous journals, spanning from 1748 until his death in 1786, chronicle not only the brutal management of enslaved people, but also reveal the everyday rhythms of the plantation world, the weather's sway, the cycles of planting and harvest, and the stark realities of control and resistance. His writings reflect a man embodying cruelty, yet deeply enmeshed in the very fragile structure of power he sought to maintain. Thistlewood's records offer unflinching detail about labor assignments, food allotments, and the death rates among the enslaved, all cataloged with bureaucratic precision, beside descriptions of physical punishment for the smallest perceived infractions. His diaries expose the grim tableau of violence that underscored plantation life, from frequent floggings to invented tortures designed to instill terror. Interwoven with this brutality are accounts of his sexual exploitation of enslaved women, which he recorded with disturbing clinical detachment, noting not only acts of assault, but also punishments for resistance. The diaries further illuminate the complex social web among the colonial elite and the enslaved, including his relationship with an enslaved woman named Phoeba, whom he referred to as his wife, and who he emancipated in his will. Beyond the cruelty, Thistlewood's writings capture the continuous tension wrought by rumors of runaway slaves, insurrections, and the persistent presence of Jamaican Maroons, escaped slaves, who lived free in the island's mountainous regions, a living symbol of defiance against the plantation regime. The scent of smoke rising from Maroon villages and the stories that traveled through plantation quarters underscored a constant undercurrent of resistance. Thistlewood's detailed meteorological notes, gradual changes in wind and rain, shifts in temperature, frame the plantation's harsh natural environment, where human suffering was set against the relentless forces of climate and time. His diaries are both a bureaucratic ledger and a dark narrative of domination, resistance, and survival, exposing the brutal machinery that enslaved thousands while hinting at the fragile humanity lodged in this cruel world. For any understanding of the overseer's vanished fate, these writings stand as a stark mirror reflecting the tension, violence, and complexity of plantation power and survival. The final chapters of the plantation's dark tale unfold in the early dawn, where whispered confessions and fractured loyalties ripple among those bound by labor and fear. In the fragile calm after the storm of disappearance, the enslaved wrestle with choices forged by desperation, the choice between survival and rebellion, safety and justice. The air is heavy with unease, the scent of damp earth mingling with the ash of faded fires, as silent reckonings take root beneath swollen eyes and trembling hands. Grace, the silent protagonist, emerges subtly as a beacon of complex courage amid this fraught landscape. Her movements, careful and deliberate, betray a mind turning over grim realities. Every glance toward the absent overseer's hat, every furtive exchange behind swaying shuttered windows, reveals a calculus of hope and fear. She listens to the murmurs of the quarters, the dissonant chorus of sorrow and defiance, and weighs the odds of resistance against the cost of silence. Would you bear such a burden, the weight of conscience tethered by chains of survival? Confessions break through the heavy silence like shards of cold glass. Some reveal truths long suppressed, the cruelty endured, the secrets shared, the seeds of rebellion planted in quiet desperation. Betrayals surface alongside acts of solidarity, trust fractures, yet a resilient community threads itself together beneath the overseer's vanished shadow. The tenuous social fabric holds as stories ripple and swell, implicating both oppressors and the oppressed in a narrative laced with moral ambiguity. Who is the enemy when survival demands compromises that stain the soul? As dawn widens and the first light fractures the darkness, there is no tidy resolution, only the complex aftermath of choices that echo through hearts and history. The overseer's absence remains a void, his fate a whispered enigma, but in that space, a fragile hope flickers, the hope that silence can be broken, and history reclaimed by those who lived its burden. The lieutenant shadows of the past shift in the new light, shifting from instruments of terror to symbols of remembrance and quiet resistance. And so the reckoning begins, not with fire or shout, but with the slow, steady reclaiming of voice and story beneath the lingering weight of that abandoned hat. The Thomas Thistlewood Papers stand as one of the most remarkable and unsettling historical archives chronicling life on an 18th-century Jamaican plantation. These diaries, spanning nearly 4 decades from 1748 to 1786, document in exhaustive and often graphic detail the daily workings, brutal discipline, and complex social dynamics of plantation slavery. Thistlewood, an English overseer turned owner, recorded everything with bureaucratic precision, from labor quotas and food provisions to medical observations and weather patterns. The faint scent of crushed vegetation and the prickling heat of the Jamaican sun are felt through his meticulous notes, grounding the brutality in lived reality. Most starkly, the diaries lay bare Thistlewood's relentless cruelty and embedded violence, including thousands of assaults on enslaved women he recorded without remorse, alongside punitive measures against those who resisted. These records reveal a world where violence was routine, systematized, and often ritualized, ordered to enforce domination and suppress resistance. His detailed accounts of torture and punishment, including the infamous Derby's dose ritual, offer a haunting insight into the calculated cruelty that defined overseer authority. Yet, amidst this horrific control, the papers also grant rare glimpses into the endurance and strategies of the enslaved. Thistlewood noted with frustration the frequent misbehavior, resistance, and runaways, testaments to the unyielding spirit beneath the oppression. His interactions with Jamaican Maroons, escaped slaves who lived free in mountainous hideouts, underscore the ongoing contest between domination and defiance. The smell of smoke from distant fires and the secret networks of communication form a subtle undercurrent in these records, highlighting cultural persistence amid brutality. Besides cruelty and resistance, the diaries reveal facets of Thistlewood's personal contradictions, his attempts at gardening, his social ties among the colonial elite, and his complex relationship with Phoeba, an enslaved woman he emancipated and regarded as his wife. These layers enrich our understanding of plantation life's psychological and social complexity. The papers form not only a log of oppression, but a detailed chronicle of a volatile world shaped by power, fear, resilience, and the constant tension between submission and freedom. Through this archive, the vanished overseer's story finds profound resonance, illuminating the hard-edged realities behind his haunting absence.